Hello again, and welcome to Sundays at Hope. This week we're continuing our series throughout the book of Isaiah on the theme "The Lord Saves," which is the meaning of his name. This week we're looking at chapter 40 and the theme of God's comfort for his suffering people. And we need to return to what we're looking at in our Bible discussions on Tuesday, the story of Hezekiah's sickness and recovery and his meetings with the envoys of the king of Babylon. What's really fascinating here is the order of chapters has been switched around. So actually 38 and 39, there's good reason to think it happens before or during the very start of Sennacherib's invasion. And it sets the scene for the change in theme that chapter 40 is going to introduce. And so, very briefly, Hezekiah becomes sick to the point of death, and he is very distraught by this, and he cries out to God to remember how he has sought to follow him and trust him all the days of his life. And to be merciful to him, and God hears and assures him that he will add 15 years to his life, and Hezekiah responds in a song of praise, thanking God because he knows how sorrowful he was and praises God that he has lifted him up. And so that sounds like an excellent always beginning of this side. And in fact, actually, God does a miraculous sign in the land. He causes, whether it's the sun or just the shadow, for it to turn back in time as a sign to Hezekiah that this healing he desired will occur. And that then links into chapter 39, where it seems in a moment of complacency, Hezekiah fails a significant test of faith. So again, it said that the king of Babylon, which is at the time a relatively less powerful nation, it's linked to Assyria and is seeking to break away from Assyrian rule and an opportunity to do that. And the king is called Merodach-baladan, and it seems he's heard of a few things. He's been likely following the progress of Judah at this time, because Judah has succeeded in breaking away from Assyrian rule. He's aware, and it seems, of the prosperity and grace that God has shown to Judah at this time under Hezekiah's rule. You read through some of the parallel passages in 2 Kings and 2nd Chronicles, how amazingly good. There have never been as good times of restoration as since Solomon's time. When Hezekiah came into power, the restoration of the temple worship, the sense of joy in the land, the unity of heart throughout Judah, to love the Lord, to serve the Lord, physical prosperity, material blessing, and that piques perhaps the king of Babylon's interests. But on top of that, he's aware that yes, he has been sick and is likely close to death, and yet miraculously has recovered from death. So here's a king who hasn't just succeeded in breaking away from the tyrant at the time, the powerful tyrant Sennacherib, but seems to be undergoing significant lessons and has escaped death by the power of his God. And then on top of that, the thing about Babylon, whether around that time or much later on, they had a highly disciplined approach to the study and perhaps even worship of the stars. And so this sign, perhaps all these things intrigue Merodach, and it says he sends the envoys with a letter and with a present because he's heard that Hezekiah has been sick and has recovered. But when you look in the parallel passages, there's really a sense that he's also coming to inquire, whether in secret or in the open, inquire about the sign, inquire what's going on here, and perhaps even make an offer of an alliance, a strategic alliance to overthrow, to turn against the king of Assyria. And Hezekiah fails the test wholeheartedly. It says again, he is moved by pride almost. He doesn't return to God the honor that he has given him. It's almost he welcomes gladly this nation that does not honor the Lord. There's a big thing here about the culture at the time. The kings of the nations named themselves by their gods. And so Merodach-baladan, Merodach is one of his gods, but also Baladan is Baal is his lord, or Baal is his god. So he is not just the king of his kingdom, he is really the envoy of his god. And so it was very much seen the prosperity of the nation, or the glory of the nation, is in a sense of representation before their eyes of the power of their gods. So here comes the servant of Merodach and Baal being his lord, and Hezekiah welcomes them wholeheartedly and shows them absolutely everything, the glories of his kingdom. He shows them the wealth in all his treasure houses, everything. And there is the sense that he does not give honor to God all the time that he is doing this. And it seems the envoys of the king of Babylon leave with a sense that Hezekiah is fully interested in this treaty and has welcomed them wholeheartedly. And Isaiah, when he hears about this and comes, Isaiah gives some very strong words of warning. He says in chapter 39 at the end, listen to the message of the Lord who rules over all. He says, you can be sure that a time will come when everything in your palace will be carried off to Babylon. Everything the kings before you have stored up until this day will be taken away. There will be nothing left, says the Lord. Some of the members of your family line will be taken away. They will be your own flesh and blood. They will include the children who will be born into your family line. They will serve the king of Babylon in his palace. So there is a very devastating word said about the future of the nation is going to be taken away not by Assyria, as it were, which God promised before that he was going to save him from. God will still keep that promise, but is going to be taken by the very people he's just welcomed. This offer of the hand will backfire and will mean the prosperity of Israel, many of the Israelites, and even the children who he, it seems at this time, hasn't even given birth to yet. Some will go and will be eunuchs in the land of Babylon. What is really surprising is the word that Hezekiah says at the end of it. The message that the Lord has spoken through you is good. Hezekiah replied. He thought there will be peace and safety while I'm still living. Now, for the people who would hear these words afterwards, it would be immensely heartbreaking. Their king has bartered away their future, their prospects. One of the reasons this has been rearranged is because even though Hezekiah is before God a faithful king, and we see that because he cries out to God when Sennacherib invades, the people see that this is the introduction, this is the starting point for how Babylon would become the empire that took them out of Judah. This was the starting point. And at that point, Hezekiah the king shows no interest in the long-term realities of the nation and of God's promise to his people. He doesn't even care that his own sons, children of David, through whom God's promise is supposed to come and blessing to the nation, will be taken and will not have heirs. They will be eunuchs. And he barters them away because he says there will be peace and security in my time. In fact, I think it is in 2 Kings, it goes even further. Why not if there will be peace and security in my time? And the people are faced with this deep pain that the kings they asked for, and they look at the long line of the history of all their kings, though even there were some who were faithful, yet there is that sense that all of them followed this archetype when they were left to themselves. They gathered for themselves from the people and didn't, at their worst moments, care for the people. They might remember when they first asked for a king, and God, through the prophet Samuel, told them that this was going to happen, and they didn't care. And so now they're heartbroken, and they are looking up with a sense of pain and guilt and hopelessness. And that is where Isaiah 40 comes in with great and marvelous hope. So at this point, we're going to be breaking off into groups and really asking one major question and thinking, discussing, confessing, and praying about that. And the question is, as we, as God's church, wait for the fulfillment of God's promise, what are the things we sense in our own hearts we place so much of our hopes in that are not God's, even if they're good things or excellent things, whether out of envy for the world or just because we desire them? What are the things we are craving that end up letting us down and end up disappointing us? What are we hoping for right now to such a great degree that it almost takes our hearts away from the promise of God? Let's work through that in groups. So, as we said, as we enter into chapter 40, the people of God, whether it's during the exile now in Babylon or having returned, feel a great sense of not just pain and loss from the experiences they've had, but also the deep disappointment as they read this, that the king who they called over them, even the good and faithful king, was part of the reason they got here, and he didn't care that they would be getting here. And as they're downtrodden, God comes into that mix to speak his words of encouragement to them. He says, comfort my people, says your God, comfort them, speak tenderly to the people of Jerusalem, announce to them that their hard labor has been completed, tell them that their sin has been paid for, tell them that the Lord has punished them enough for all their sins. And God is saying there that even though they got into the situation because they rejected him as their king and wanted a king like the other nations had got, and they suffered under that at this point in time to the very end, being sent to exile. He, the king they have rejected, is coming to woo them. He is coming to comfort them. He is coming to end their suffering and their warfare. They've been punished enough, he says. He's coming with reward and with recompense in his hands. And he is coming as the gentle shepherd, the gentle king, who is going to take care of them in such a gentle fashion. It says he will take care of his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms. He carries them close to his heart. He gently leads those that have little ones. God is on his way, he says, for his people. He's on his way to encourage them, to bless them, to be their king, the king that they spurned, but to be their delight and comfort even in this pain. And that then sets up a shift, as it were, for the job of the prophets in terms of how they are to proclaim their message. For Isaiah before, the commission was preach these words until the people go into destruction. Now he gets almost a different call. And so he sees this vision, as it were, he hears these words. A messenger is calling out in the desert, prepare a way for the Lord, make straight road through it for our God. Every valley will be filled in, every mountain and hill shall be made level, the rough ground will be smoothed out, the rocky places shall be made flat. Then the glory of the Lord will appear, and everyone will see it together. The Lord has spoken. So the shift, and it really shows itself throughout the rest of Isaiah, the shift in the prophetic tone now is preparing the way for this coming God as king. And it's going to be in such a way, Isaiah says, that everyone, all flesh, another place says, will see it together, will see God's glory as he comes to his people. And so that's the job description. But then the question is, okay, what in particular does he have to say? What are the words, as it were, that he will be saying? And he says, cry out. And Isaiah says, what should I cry? Cry out, all people are like grass. They don't stay faithful to me any longer than wildflowers last. The grass dries up, the flowers fall to the ground. That happens when God makes his wind blow on them. So people are just like grass. The grass dries up, the flowers fall to the ground. But what our God says will stand forever. And really what that means in the context of the people's pains and challenges is God is re-establishing himself as the only sustainable hope for his people, even as they wait for his promise to come to them. So he says, all flesh, this is what got them into this situation in the first place. They wanted the king to be like the other nations. They saw the glory of the other nations and this idea of the gods before them going out with them in conquest, laying other nations to siege and in the dust and setting them ablaze. And they wanted that, a king to judge them, to fight our battles, they said. And God is saying here, I am the one in whom your hope should stand. All flesh is nothing but grass. The flowers fall to the ground. They don't last. Their beauty doesn't last. I am the one who lasts forever. And so he draws that out. He draws out all the more with a few parallels, as it were, between his wisdom and implied the wisdom of any king, and his might and power, and that of any king, and his glory. And so when it comes to creation and beauty and glory, he says, who has measured the oceans in the palms of his hand? Who has used the width of his hand to mark off the sky? Who's measured out the dust of the earth in a basket? Who's weighed the mountains on the scales? You're impressed, my children, by the glories of these kings and their nations. You're impressed by that. Have you considered, I am the one, my arms, my hand is filled with power to measure out the oceans when I created it? And that's what he's saying. And then he moves into wisdom. He says, who can understand the Spirit of God? Who has ever given him advice? Did the Lord ask anyone to help him understand? Did he have to ask someone to teach him the right way? Who taught him what he knows? Who showed him how to understand? And God is saying, you wanted a man like you with great wisdom to judge you, to decide right from wrong for the nation. I am the one to whom wisdom belongs. I give wisdom to one and to the other, not man. And then he compares it with the glory that they sought of the empires, the nations reaching out far across and gathering up all the lands for themselves and their gods. And he says the nations are only a drop in the bucket to him. He considers them as nothing but dust on the scales. He weighs the islands as though they were fine dust. Lebanon, a place seen for its great trees, does not have enough trees to keep its altar fires burning. It doesn't have enough animals to sacrifice as burnt offerings to himself. He goes so far as to say, in comparison to the glory of the princes and the kings of the nations, have you not heard, have you not seen from the beginning that God sits on the throne high above the earth, and its people look like grasshoppers to him? All these kings that you're so enamored by, they are nothing but grasshoppers in my sight, and he's the one who blows on them and dries them up. And then finally he appeals to the stars, as it were. Remember, the people of Babylon revered the stars greatly, and he says, look up at these stars. I created them. I created them. You cannot compare me to a god. You cannot compare me to princes. You cannot compare me to the glories of the nations. I am the one by my great power and might. I call them to be, and not one of them is missing. So at this stage, we're going to again break off into groups and discuss these questions. Are the beauties of the flowers of the field, as it were, to be rejected because of the fact that we're meant to trust in the Lord? Are we supposed to just completely reject them? If so, then why? And if not, how then are we to respond to the beauties of the flowers of the field, these hopes that we have, even as we wait for our coming King? And then secondly, the question to discuss is, why are our King's words worthy of our unbroken affections for him as we wait for him? So let's split off into groups and discuss those questions. So we don't have much time left, but we just want to look at the last section of this and how God draws conclusions or outtakes from what he has been saying in Isaiah 40 for his people. So he calls them because of all these things, because he is the true king who is coming, who is powerful, who is mighty, and he showed them his glories. He says this to them: family of Jacob, why do you complain that the Lord doesn't notice our condition? People of Israel, why do you say our God doesn't pay any attention to our rightful claims? Don't you know who made everything? Haven't you heard about him? The Lord is the God who lives forever. He created everything on earth. He won't become worn out or get tired. No one will ever know how great his understanding is. He gives strength to those who are tired. He gives power to those who are weak. Even young people become worn out and get tired. Even the best of them trip and fall. But those who trust in the Lord will receive new strength. They will fly as high as eagles. They will run and not get tired. They will walk and not grow weak. And so God is drilling all of this down as his people wait for his coming. Indeed, as long as it takes for him to come, he is telling them throughout the words of Isaiah 40 that they shouldn't feel, because of maybe the slowness of his arrival or how hard things are going to get. Indeed, for the people of Israel, things were still going to get very, very hard after coming back from exile. He says, at no point should you be tempted to think that I've become worn out or tired in keeping my promise to you, or that I'm not going to be faithful to you, or that I disregard your cause, I've disregarded my promise to you. He's calling them. He's calling them to look to him because of all these things, to look to him and to wait patiently for him, to trust in him, to not become like their fathers who were tempted by other kings because they seemed more appealing, to not judge by appearances, but in waiting for him and keeping the mind on him. He says he will give strength to them. He gives strength to those who are tired. He gives power to those who are weak. And even if in the world we live in, those who are seen to have most strength, the young people, as it were, become worn out and get tired. And even if the best of them trip and fall, he says this to his people who are weak and tired and maybe weary. Those who trust in the Lord and wait for him, they receive new strength from him. He is compassionate, and they will fly as high as eagles, and they will run and not get tired, and they will walk and not grow weak as they wait for him. Because, and the whole point of it is, there is work for them to be done. There are things for them to do as a people as they wait for the coming of the King. And so he will uphold them, he will bless them, he will keep them, so that they will serve him faithfully all their days until he returns. And so we're just going to pray about that right now. Let's pray together that the glory and the greatness of our King would be always before our eyes, so that, in increasing measure, we would wait patiently for him. And then secondly, that his comfort be so deeply felt by us as we wait for him, that we would not grow weary, and that we would be strengthened with great power and might to do the works that he has left for us to do whilst we wait for him.